really happy to have you both with us.
Thank you, Susan.
I think you should start speaking.
Well, hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for everybody in attendance here today. This is a great crowd and really appreciated, and for everybody who's online as well. I guess I will begin, Susan, with regard to our topic, patent landscapes and IP lessons learned. So, we had a bit of a debate before this session to try and figure out what would be appealing and attractive to an audience. And really, a landscape can be quite broad and can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So I think what we want to cover off is our few kind of best practices with respect to anybody involved in IP landscapes, what are the kind of do's and don'ts, also really maybe some case studies as well. And I would encourage anybody with questions, please ask. The Canadian government has done a fantastic job in funding funds for IP startups. To me, it's unheralded. I work globally with many companies, and we are like the envy of many companies, especially in the US, where there are funds available for startups, creative companies to figure out how to get around the costly barrier of entry with respect to patents. And we'll talk a little bit on the what we would classify as a pure landscape, but not only about its operation. So usually it's a SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, etc., but really what to do after you receive it. Because what we think is one of the biggest issues is most people receive a landscape and it sits on a bookshelf somewhere and they check the mark and off they go. I want to talk a little bit about the process and who should be looking at it, who should be reviewing it, and what are those lessons. So that's what I'm going to cover off today, hopefully within 28 minutes. And over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to emphasize, the thank you for everyone who's here and for having us out here. The companies here are very fortunate in the resources. So just sort of echoing Connor's comment about having the availability of these resources for startups in the U.S. You just don't, right? I mean, you either craft strategies to work around some of the costs of patenting, or you take the risk with regard to that, or you just have the resources because you have the resources. And so, I mean, for early stage companies, you guys are very fortunate to have these resources. So I think I would emphasize making use of those as best as possible.
And that's a very good point. And I actually heard from a U.S. counsel the other day, because I mentioned the granting process. And yeah, it's to be envied that we have this in Canada. So.
Yeah, and I would look at, so a landscape, fundamentally, whether it's patent landscape, driving across the city, to traverse a landscape, really you need a roadmap. And the roadmap really is the constituent of a deliverable. And the deliverable, what we would consider a regular landscape, there's bibliography, details, market information, competitor information, and usually next steps. And that's when you commission a landscape, and again, across the country, there's incredible funding to establish that. What we see in our part of the world, and again, our company, we help clients, whether they're monetizing, enforcing, optimizing their portfolios on kind of one end. So that includes like reverse engineering, et cetera. But on the other end is creating IP. So helping them establish a footprint, a foothold, and to ensure continuity with their business. And one of the biggest problems or challenges we see is there's not good alignment between the intellectual property strategy and the business strategy. They're usually seen as two independent paths. And what we try to do, and we're seeing it more and more now through education, is combining those two activities. So when a deliverable is received, the first thing we do is ensure that people are educated on it, reread it, but really understand the composition of the deliverable. So oftentimes that it would be competitor analysis, trends, IP strategy yourself, where are the white spaces to look for so you're not patenting in a particular direction. And this all sounds very obvious, but believe me, We see a ton of companies who spent a fortune and placed bets on their company based on a strategy document that they've never really reviewed, only but once. So what we're trying to do is really make people aware that once you receive that document, that landscape, you start to really effectively review it with your team. If you have investors, bring them into the room, because that's the source of your next round of financing. Everybody you talk to in IP will tell you that they understand their patents pretty well. And they're sometimes, as Houston talked about earlier, they're concerned about looking at other people's patents. Well, there's workarounds for that, and ignorance is not an excuse. But again, in some instances, we need to review patents of a competitor, and we're identifying where our client can then start to migrate their patent and R&D developments towards a particular area. And that might take years. It might take 18, 24, 36 months to start to show up. But if you can show to your investors, show to your team, retention is also a big issue in startups. And if you can show a good critical path towards a goal through your IP, that also helps in retention aspect. And what about yourself?
Yeah, I'm going to say, going back to Houston's points earlier, IP strategy is if you have a comprehensive business strategy includes IP strategy. And I think a lot of people think of them as being sort of two different things, but it's part of the business strategy. The business strategy is your technical strategy and your technical roadmap, your sort of pure business, marketing and sales, and intellectual property, especially in this day and age of the way business is growing in these sort of tech hubs. And the IP landscapes are a really critical foundational element of the IP strategy. It's a lot of information, it's a key input, but it's not in and of itself the end of the day. It's what do you make use of this information, and how do you incorporate that into your strategy and then eventually into your plan to execute against. And so having both people and some insights about what your plans are, what you'd like to do, to incorporate the data that comes out of the roadmaps, out of the landscapes is really important. But also having people to follow up and be able to make use of that and make them actionable decisions from it.
Yeah, and I would say everybody believes that their patents are going to be there for 20 years, and we talked earlier, it's a very expensive undertaking. In our world, from a competitive analysis point of view, we're reviewing portfolios all the time. So we deal with companies who will come to us with maybe it's an assertion or a defensive position where they're being asserted against, and we're trying to either invalidate the asserter's patents, or somebody's trying to negotiate a license that hasn't gone very well, so they're deciding to go into a monetization position. These patents are again, they're a fundamental part of the business, and a lot of people will rely on their patent position to be the foundation of their company. You have to be very, very careful on that, because organizations like ours, and there are many out there, are paid basically to try and kill patents. And sometimes we need to tell a founder or an inventor that they're metaphorically their baby's ugly, right? Yeah. It's a really good invention. You spend a lot of time and effort on it, but you can't do two things. And again, Houston talked on this earlier. Is one is supportability and one is detectability. So we talked about detectability earlier, and that's being able to find and prove whether the patent is being infringed by a third party. And supportability is basically is where is it being used. So we will identify where a particular technology is. And again, these are tips for yourselves to be thinking about. If you've got an innovation, start looking around. There's lots of information out there, but use a professional alongside you to basically guide you. But identify where these technologies reside. Start to look at patents, and if you're concerned about willful infringement, etc., have a third party do that with you. Identify whether there are gaps in their claims to be able to take advantage of. If you've got a patent that's issued, looking at continuations to basically leapfrog where your competitors are versus where you need to be. And again, always updating your investors and your team on the progress is critical, because that's always going to be the first person who asks you every quarter is how your product's doing, how your sales are going, and what's your IP position. So you really have don't be shy about asking. It's super important that you're brave enough to put your hand up and say, I need some help, right?
Yeah, and I think also I like to add on to that as far as, it's the patent landscape, but again, there is also, it's beyond patents too. You go back to what Yusin was talking about with trade secrets and other forms of intellectual property, and even a layer on top of that, I like to think about intellectual assets and know-how and the value of know-how. And so that's where the context of how do you incorporate all this data, this patent data, into sort of the bigger picture of, well, how am I competitively matched up against those in the marketplace and the opportunity, and how, what is my advantage and how am I going to leverage my advantage into that opportunity, and understanding where my strengths lie, and to what extent can I lean on patents, to what extent can I not rely on patents, to what extent are there other things I need to leverage in order to capture advantage and make the most of it. And I'll address one point. And it's not just a startup issue, right? This grows as companies get bigger and mature. You're having, because this is part and parcel of strategy, you're having to revisit this all the time. So, strategy never changes. Every year you're revisiting your strategy. The environment changes, market changes, things that change internally within the companies. So you're having to revisit these things. And so, the work that goes into commissioning landscape work, you periodically have to keep refreshing.
And in that theme, I would say that one of the things we're hearing, and we heard it from Houston earlier, and in my experience, I usually am the in-house counsel at small companies, or in my past, is this is not your IP counsel, your IP team is going to be, you work with them continuously. There's no one and done. It's part of your life. And finding a good partner or counsel, it might be external counsel, it might be somebody like Connor to help you find that, is really important as you begin, and to keep that as part of your budget going forward as well.
Yeah, I think thanks, Susan, for pointing that out. Actually, what we try to do is when we engage with any client, especially from a landscape point of view, is there's going to be homework, and what we expect is there are findings, next steps, critical next steps. We'll go through those in detail. The amount of detail required is up to the client. But then what we'll do is we'll set up whether it's quarterly, monthly, it could be bi-yearly, review on where they've consumed it, and then they're starting to think about how does this apply to our business. They talk to R&D, and the R&D are saying, hey, you know what, we're working on a prototype. We're starting to come back in and say, okay, these are the 4 things we recommended or suggested, and we agreed on them. Where are we? So really to try and encourage that process. It's like any business, right? You need to always be thinking
I think that's
years ahead.
And that's a really important point, because you talk about bringing in R&D. I think bringing in the different stakeholders internally, because everyone has a different perspective with regard to the IP analysis. So you've got the R&D group and the engineering groups are on the technical side. You have the sales groups and the strategy behind that. Bringing them in and getting that feedback from the different internal components, as well as your external, like whether it's your investors, is also important.
Yeah, and buy-in again, for many operation, whether a large company or a startup, the prospect of working with a law firm can be quite ominous, right? And sometimes the only time people think about law firms or a lawyer is when they're buying a house or getting divorced. So I don't really think clearly about how IP, and I say that very selectively, but a lot of people don't think about how IP can really promote your company. And we've had instances where we've had clients who, multinationals, so for instance a large car manufacturer in the US, like huge, they really had to change their direction about 5 years ago from a combustion engine company to an EV company, and with tens of thousands of patents and hundreds of engineers and tons of resources, they really struggled to change position. So again, this isn't a startup situation. It's a major corporation, multinational, that needed to pivot using the findings of a landscape to start navigating and building direction towards where they are today. And that happened within 4 years, where they're now actually licensing some of their technology to third parties. So again, it's about continuity. It's about repetition. And again, it's about educating your team about what you're doing within IP.
Yeah, and I think even at Xera, so if I think back at when I first started with them, there was patent peace coming out of the late 2000s, but that patent peace was eroding as those patents that were subject to the patent peace were expiring, and so the landscape was changing. So the market was changing, but also the terms in which the deals that were struck in 2000 and 2005 were changing. And so, you move forward, fast forward to 2015 and 2017, 2020, the landscape between one company, the competitive nature, or not native, the competitiveness between one company and another was changing, because not only were their sales changing in the marketplace, but also their portfolios were changing, and how much was licensed and how much was unlicensed was changing. And as a result, you had to reassess, okay, well, how do we measure up against our competitors today, given that all these things have changed, and your decisions in the interim have an impact on that. So I think, if the more that we did analysis along the way, the better we could prepare for those later dates, when later stages, in terms of like when we were getting more and more out of that sort of patent piece. And I think, one of the things that reflecting back when I came in on the role, a lot of that work hadn't been done. And so we started fresh from, okay, we haven't looked at this stuff in 10 years. Now where are we? The delta was gigantic versus having an incremental, continual monitoring of what are we doing? How are we changing things? How is the landscape changing? How are we changing our filing strategy to make the most of the current circumstances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we're dealing with companies, we're dealing with investors, and oftentimes we'll get an investor coming to us and saying, "Can you assess this portfolio, supportability, detectability?" I speak to a lot of CIPOs globally, and they know we're Canadian, and they're saying, "Hey, what's going on in Canada?" And I talk about what the government's doing here, or in fact, not provincially, but across the country. And again, I mentioned it earlier, there's a huge amount of envy about how this is working. But the question I ask back to these companies, especially in the US, is what are the challenges? Like, why aren't you hitting up Canadian companies? And we got incredible technology, incredible engineers, incredible patents starting to come through. And they're going that 99% of the companies that approach them for licensing partnerships are really patent savvy. They understand the IP ecosystem. We talked about the strategy aspect, landscaping, whatever. They're well educated, and when they are presenting, they have a story to tell. And this is part of the journey in front of us in this room and online, is really start to get a succinct vision of your strategy and be able to articulate it. So if you do come up on a stage like this, you're able to talk very clearly about where you are, where you're going, and where you've been, right? Because that's usually part of that journey. And I think that's the biggest thing I get from when I talk to people with respect to opportunity, is they say that it's a patent awareness. And I'm telling people many times that that's changing, and in part because of the people in this room, that awareness and that professionalism is really changing quickly. So it's great to be part of.
Yeah, and it's the patent awareness, and it's also the integration of that awareness into the bigger picture and the business strategy, right? Being able to articulate that as, well, what does this mean from a product sales and market, a sort of market growth perspective. But I think going back, and it's not just the US, right? It's Japan, it's Europe, very IP savvy, very strategic, maybe in some respects even more strategic than US companies are.
Yeah, and again, this is not all about organic growth, right? So there's partnership opportunities, and that could be a like-type company. We look pretty heavily on adjacent markets. So if you're working in a particular area, where would that adjacent market be for your technology? So it's another revenue stream to consider. Again, always being mindful of your investors, to update them. But also with adjacent markets comes new revenue opportunities that tend not to be a concern over infringement. You're not being targeted by the top tier in your vertical. You're able to operate pretty quietly and bring in revenue as and when needed.
Yeah, and partnerships as well, right? I think any either acquisition, divestiture, or partnership is part of the conversation. Is also, whether it's implicit or explicit, is the IP comparison. Like, what do you have and what do I have? You have a set of assets, you have a product or service that you're trying to sell, you have market capture, you have certain capabilities, you have certain channels and relationships, and so does your partner. And what are the synergies? Where is there competition between the two of you? And what are you trying to accomplish as a goal business wise? And how do you leverage all your assets? And it's just part of the discussion.
Yeah, and just on the last point on partnerships, licensing obviously goes without saying. Like type companies in your sector are adjacent markets. But there's also a lot of in the last probably 5 years, organizations have come out and they're basically work with multinationals. For instance, you can join a consortium and they will share patents. So they'll pool a lot of patents in a particular area. And if you're under a certain market size, which most startups are, you can join for free, and then you get the benefits of cross-licensing their technology. And again, each of these kind of organizations has a different function. A lot of them take care of non-practicing entities to ensure you're starting out, you're not getting knocked back. And others are around core technology areas. So just being able to promote whether it's standard essential patents or RCPs or implementation patents. But again, those are options to ask about and consider, right? So don't start from zero. Ask and figure out this problem is, trust me, has been experienced before. Ask a question of people around you in your community, and you should be able to get at least a direction and an answer.
Yeah, and I think more specifically to the group here, I mean, you're thinking about acquisition, and part of the acquisition analysis is also the portfolio. So it's an important element of the discussion. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if we should open it up for a few questions before we run out of time.
Sure.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And if no one raises their hand, I'll feel a bit dumb. So hopefully somebody has a question. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Connor. Having been through a couple of these landscaping practices with organizations, because they've all both found it very, very useful. It just turned on, so I'll keep on talking anyway.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a lot of data that comes out of these landscaping operations, a lot of information as well, sort of summarized presentation and so on. But what I was wondering is whether there is any additional
I'll repeat the question if I can after.
Yeah.
Any additional market analysis that you could provide? Because the sense that I got from the people doing the landscaping work was that they had a very strong understanding of the market, not from a customer perspective, but from a supplier, developer, investor perspective. And that sort of information is very useful to any small business that's sort of developing its own strategy.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And just to repeat the question is if there's market intelligence that follows on from the deliverable. And I think that talks to, we talked about it earlier, the journey begins when you receive it or your client receives it. It doesn't end. So we will always give the underlying data. Also, most of these projects are done by engineers who are SMEs or subject matter experts, and they're always available. What we try to do as a follow-on in a month or whatever the cadence needs to be is there will be questions coming back to us and saying, hey, we've noticed something else, or and can you extract some more data? So really, if we can just view a landscape not as a stationary thing, but a moving plan, and if that's the case, I encourage both parties that we're talking about to come back and say, this is what we're thinking, because we're going to be talking to them about the same thing. So best practice is we're going to be, on their case a little bit, because we want to make sure we can leverage and they can leverage our skill set and really take that data to the next level.
Yeah, and landscapes aren't all created equal, right? I mean, you get different takes on what should be in a landscape from just purely citation analysis, and they try to glean some business information from it to very more holistic. We do a market analysis and we try to fold in the citation and other IP analysis into the landscape. And so that's part of the interview process when you're looking at, vendors or consultants or even your own internal people. Like, what are your expectations in terms of what comes out of the landscape? And then secondarily, like integrating that with your own knowledge. Like, to the extent it's not giving you everything, how do you integrate that with the information that you do know about the market, your competitors, your products, et cetera?
Yeah, and real quick, just to finish that thought, is these projects are around, can be about 4 to 6 weeks to end to end. And generally speaking, when we've done many of them, they change direction halfway through. So we get to a certain point, and then there's a pivot point where someone's saying, hey, we want to have a look at this adjacent market or some findings from our competitors we're very interested in, and it takes a different direction. So yeah, it's pretty pliable when it comes to the deliverable.
One last one from online, sorry.
Yeah, does greater IP awareness produce better R&D, or does successful R&D produce better IP? What produces better commercialization?
Well, I think they're interrelated, right? So good R&D has an awareness of IP. So I know, researchers who, especially I think some of the ones that I probably guarded, I would consider to be some of the better researchers, at least more successful. They look at patents. It's part of the landscape of information. There are publications. It's a form of publications. Understanding the state of the art is more than just reading the academic documents. It's also understanding patents. Those individuals who are really good are also looking to invent into white space. They don't want to be in an area where it's crowded and they won't, either their invention won't be well known, or if they're trying to publish, their ideas won't be as separate and well known. So they're looking for white space. So I think they have a good understanding of IP, and then but the IP that comes out of that as a result tends to be better IP. I mean, it's an area that is not well claimed by others, and so you get some better patent opportunities, or patenting opportunities, I should say.
So I think, Angie, it's up to Angie. No,
Sorry,
we're out of time.
We got
Sorry.
But I think most of these panelists will be at the networking event, so you can ask them then.
Yes,
There will be
come
opportunity.
to us later.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Susan, Michael, and Connor.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay.